You ever feel completely alone in the world, only to discover that something has been watching you the whole time? I used to think solitude was my peace, until it turned into my nightmare. 3 years ago, I took a summer job as a fire lookout in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. The idea was simple: I'd spend 3 months in a 12 by 12 cabin perched atop a mountain, watching for wildfires. The job paid decently, and the isolation was exactly what I needed after a rough breakup. No distractions, no people, just me and the wilderness. It started off like a dream. The view was stunning, with miles of pine-covered ridges stretching out in every direction. The silence was thick and comforting. My days were simple: scan the horizon, log weather conditions, and report anything suspicious. Nights were even quieter. I'd cook a small meal on my propane stove, read a book by lantern light, and drift off to the sound of wind slipping through the trees. But after the first 2 weeks, I started noticing oddities. One night, I woke up to a faint sound outside my cabin. It was rhythmic: tap, tap, tap. My heart thudded as I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it out the window. Nothing, just darkness. The sound stopped. I convinced myself it was a branch swaying in the wind, though the air had been eerily still that night. The next morning, I found scratches on the wooden door, long, deliberate marks that hadn't been there before. They were too high up to be made by an animal and too deep to be the work of some wandering camper. I reported it to my supervisor, who brushed it off as just nature doing its thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About a week later, during my evening scan with the binoculars, I spotted something, or someone, on the ridge across from mine. It was nearly a mile away, but the figure stood out against the tree line. At first, I thought it was a hiker. They were standing still, facing my direction. I waved, but they didn't move, not an inch. I turned to grab my radio, but when I looked back, they were gone. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but that night, I couldn't sleep. The tap, tap, tap returned. This time it sounded closer, like it was coming from beneath the cabin. My blood ran cold as I remembered that the lookout was elevated on stilts. Something, or someone, was under there. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching my flashlight until dawn. The next morning, I forced myself to check under the cabin. My heart raced as I crouched down and peered into the shadowy space. Nothing, just dirt and rocks. But when I stood back up, I saw something on the ground by the stairs, a footprint. A single bare footprint, too large to be mine. The toes were long, unnaturally so, and the heel was narrow. My stomach churned. That night, I locked every latch on the door and windows, though the locks felt pitifully flimsy. I stayed awake, listening, waiting. Around midnight, the tapping returned, but it wasn't just on the walls this time, it was on the windows. I didn't dare shine my flashlight out, whatever was out there might be staring back. The next morning, I begged my supervisor to let me come down early. He chuckled, said I was just spooking myself, and reminded me that I'd signed up for 3 months. "You'll be fine," he said. "The woods have a way of playing tricks on your mind." That night, the tricks got worse. I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. My heart nearly stopped as I bolted upright. I was sure I'd locked it. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the door. It was wide open. The beam caught nothing but the empty porch outside. My chest heaved as I stumbled toward the door, slamming it shut and securing the lock again. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The next day, I noticed something on the ridge where I'd seen the figure. I raised my binoculars and felt my stomach drop. There were shapes hanging from the trees, wooden totems, crudely carved and dangling from branches. They weren't there before. My hands shook as I lowered the binoculars. I radioed my supervisor again, my voice trembling as I described what I'd seen. He sighed and promised to send someone to check on me in a few days. But I didn't have a few days. That night, the tapping didn't come. Instead, there was a scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging along the cabin walls. It circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I turned off my lantern and sat in the dark, my heart pounding in my ears. Then came the whispering. It was faint, just outside the window. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was mocking, almost playful. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, there was nothing but darkness. The next morning, I packed my bag. I didn't care about the job, my paycheck, or the contract. I just wanted out. But as I opened the door, I froze. There, on the porch, was one of the wooden totems from the ridge. It was crudely carved into a humanoid shape, its eyes hollow and mouth stretched into a gaping grin. My hands trembled as I kicked it off the porch and bolted down the trail. The forest felt suffocating, the trees pressing in on me from all sides. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Halfway down the trail, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I spun around, but the path behind me was empty. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, thick and oppressive, until I finally reached my car. I drove straight to town, where I quit the job on the spot. My supervisor was annoyed, but I didn't care. I didn't tell him the full story, I doubt he would have believed me. But I know what I experienced wasn't just nature doing its thing. To this day, I can't go near the woods. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure on the ridge, staring at me. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tap, tap, tap. When I first took the job as a fire lookout in Oregon's remote Cascade Range, I thought it would be the perfect way to escape the noise of the world. 3 months alone in a tower, scanning for wildfires, how hard could it be? I'd heard rumors about old ghost stories tied to the forest, but I figured they were just campfire tales. Now, I wish I'd listened. The lookout tower sat on the edge of Cragg's Peak, miles away from any town. Supplies were dropped off weekly, and there was no cell service, just a two-way radio and a single road winding down the mountain. The tower itself was old but sturdy, a wooden structure with creaking floors and windows on every side. The view was breathtaking, but the silence, it was unnerving. For the first few days, it was peaceful. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and spend my day scanning the ridges for smoke. The evenings were my favorite, watching the sun melt into the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. But by the end of the first week, I started to feel watched. It's hard to describe the feeling. I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing. At night, I'd hear faint noises, branches snapping, soft crunches of footsteps below. I told myself it was just wildlife, maybe a bear or a deer passing through. Then I started finding things. One morning, I stepped out onto the balcony and saw a pile of rocks neatly stacked by the stairs. They hadn't been there the day before. I frowned, kicking them over and chalking it up to natural causes. But the next morning, they were back, this time arranged in a circle. By the third night, I started locking the door. That's when the dreams began. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with fragmented images seared into my mind, a figure standing at the foot of my bed, its face obscured, whispers echoing through the tower, too faint to understand. Every time I woke up, the air felt heavy, oppressive, like something was in the room with me. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate. My blood ran cold as I realized they were coming up toward the door. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, leaving only silence. I barely slept that night, and when dawn finally broke, I stepped outside to check the area. That's when I saw them, footprints. They were scattered around the base of the tower, leading away into the trees. But they weren't normal footprints. They were bare, with long, spindly toes that dug deep into the dirt, too large to be human, yet too deliberate to be an animal. I reported it to my supervisor over the radio. He laughed it off, saying, "Probably just some prankster trying to scare ya. Happens all the time in the woods. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to me. The following nights were worse. I started hearing knocking on the walls, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a drumbeat, 3 slow knocks, then silence. Sometimes it came from the door, other times from the windows, but no matter how quickly I looked, there was never anyone there. One night, the knocking came again, louder this time. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door, half shouting into the darkness. My voice echoed back at me, but the forest remained still. As I turned to go back inside, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long, hanging at odd angles. Its face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, but its features were wrong, too sharp, too elongated. Its eyes were sunken pits of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching me. I stumbled backward into the tower, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hand shook as I grabbed the radio, frantically calling for help, but the static crackled back at me, the signal too weak to reach anyone. Then I heard it, the footsteps. They were on the stairs again, slow and deliberate, each creak of the wood sending shivers down my spine. I clutched the flashlight, pointing it at the door. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the doorknob rattled. I screamed, backing into the corner of the cabin. The door didn't open, it couldn't, not with the lock in place, but the rattling didn't stop. It grew more violent, the entire door shaking as if something was trying to force its way in. And then it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun rose, I cautiously stepped outside. The footprints were there again, this time circling the tower like a predator stalking its prey. But this time, there was something else. On the balcony railing, carved into the wood, was a single word, leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I packed my things and left that same day, hiking down the trail as fast as my legs could carry me. The entire time, I felt that same oppressive presence, like ice boring into my back. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached my car and drove away, I didn't look back. I quit the job without explanation, and I've never gone back to the woods since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those knocks, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and I know it's still out there. I grew up hearing stories about the Ozark forests. People said they were haunted, that strange things lived out there in the dense, untamed wilderness. I never paid much attention to those tales, until I spent a summer working as a fire lookout. I took the job to pay for college. 3 months in a tower seemed like easy money, minimal human interaction, lots of solitude, and all the time in the world to read. My tower was perched on the highest ridge in the area, overlooking a seemingly endless expanse of forest. The only way to reach it was a narrow, winding dirt road, and once you were up there, you were completely alone. At first, I loved it. The quiet was intoxicating, and the views were incredible. My days were simple: scan for smoke, log weather patterns, and occasionally check in with the ranger station via radio. Nights were even quieter. I'd sit on the balcony, staring at the stars, listening to the distant hum of crickets and owls. But as the days stretched into weeks, the isolation started to wear on me. I began noticing strange things, little details that didn't add up. Like how the trees closest to the tower seemed different. Their bark was darker, almost blackened, and their branches were twisted in unnatural ways. One night, I heard faint whispers carried on the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the sound lingered, too deliberate to be dismissed. Then there was the knocking. It started one night around midnight, a single, sharp knock on the wall of the cabin. I froze, my book slipping from my hands. I waited, straining my ears, but heard nothing more. I convinced myself it was just a branch hitting the wall and went to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, there were 3 knocks, louder and more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the balcony, shining the beam into the darkness below. The forest stared back, an endless sea of black. My light caught nothing, no animals, no movement, no signs of life. But as I turned to go back inside, I felt it, something was watching me. The sensation was so strong that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I swept the flashlight across the tree line again, heart pounding, but saw nothing. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The knocking continued the next few nights, always around the same time. Sometimes it was on the walls, other times, it was on the door. I tried ignoring it, telling myself it was just the wind or animals, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. It came from the balcony. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. My bed was positioned against the far wall, with a clear view of the glass doors leading to the balcony. The curtains were half open, and through the gap, I saw movement, a shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It moved slowly, almost lazily, its long fingers trailing along the glass. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't casting a reflection in the window. I stayed frozen, praying it wouldn't notice me. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow disappeared. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found scratches on the balcony railing, deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. I radioed my supervisor, trying to explain what was happening without sounding completely insane. He laughed it off, saying it was probably a bear. But it wasn't a bear. That evening, as the sun set and the forest was swallowed by shadows, I felt the air change. It became heavy, suffocating, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. I stood on the balcony, scanning the tree line with my binoculars. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a tree, a tall, thin silhouette standing perfectly still. But as I focused on it, my stomach dropped. The figure was too straight, too human. It stood at the edge of the clearing, facing the tower, watching me. I lowered the binoculars, my hand shaking. When I looked again, it was gone. The knocking returned that night, louder than ever. It came from every side of the cabin, echoing through the walls. I huddled in the corner, clutching a kitchen knife, too terrified to move. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a new noise, footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. The stairs creaked under the weight of something heavy. My breath hitched as the footsteps reached the landing. Then came the scraping sound, dragging along the door. "Leave," a voice hissed, low and guttural. I wanted to scream, but fear choked me. The doorknob rattled, and for a moment, I thought it might burst open. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep that night. When morning finally came, I packed my things and radioed my supervisor, telling him I was leaving. I didn't care about the paycheck or the contract, I just wanted out. He sounded annoyed but didn't try to stop me. The hike down the mountain was the longest 3 hours of my life. The entire time, I felt that same oppressive presence, like ice burning into my back. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. When I finally reached my car, I found something waiting for me, a bundle of sticks tied together with twine, sitting on the hood. It was crude, almost childlike, but there was something sinister about it. My hands trembled as I shoved it off the car and sped down the dirt road, refusing to stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that tower. Months later, I looked up the history of the area, desperate to make sense of what I'd experienced. That's when I learned about the disappearances. Over the past few decades, several hikers and campers had gone missing in those woods, their bodies never found. Locals whispered about a forest spirit, something ancient and vengeful that didn't take kindly to trespassers. I don't know if that's what I saw, or if it was something worse. All I know is that I'll never go back to the woods. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice, low and guttural, whispering one word, leave. I've always loved the wilderness. Something about the isolation, the purity of the untamed woods, always drew me in. But that was before I took a job as a fire lookout in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. That summer changed everything. It showed me that some places are not meant to be disturbed. The lookout tower I was assigned to was one of the oldest in the region, built in the 1930s and rarely used. It was perched atop a remote ridge, miles from the nearest road, surrounded by dense forest. My only contact with the outside world was a two-way radio and a weekly supply drop. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time scanning the horizon for smoke, jotting down weather patterns, and enjoying the quiet. Nights were peaceful too, the kind of silence that's so deep, it feels almost sacred. But that peace didn't last. It started with the lantern. One evening, as the sun was setting, I lit the old kerosene lantern that hung near the cabin's door. I set it on the table and stepped out onto the balcony to watch the stars come out. When I went back inside, the lantern was gone. I froze, scanning the room. The lantern wasn't on the table anymore. It wasn't on the floor. It wasn't anywhere. I tried to laugh it off, maybe I'd absent-mindedly put it somewhere else, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I grabbed a flashlight and spent the rest of the night on edge, every creak of the old cabin making my heart race. The next morning, I found the lantern sitting on the ground at the base of the tower. It was standing upright, perfectly positioned, as if someone had carefully placed it there. My stomach turned. That night, I locked the door. A few days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometimes, I'd hear faint noises coming from the woods, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but whenever I shone my flashlight, the forest looked empty. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching softly in the dirt below the tower. My heart thudded in my chest as the sound grew louder, closer, up directly beneath the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, slowly, the footsteps started up the stairs. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the door, my hands trembling. The steps creaked under the weight of whatever was coming up, slow and deliberate. My pulse pounded in my ears as the doorknob jiggled, but the door didn't open. The footsteps retreated, descending the stairs one slow step at a time. I didn't move until dawn. The next morning, I found something on the stairs. A bundle of twigs, bound together with a strip of cloth, lay on the top step. The cloth was old, faded, and stained. It looked like it had been torn from a shirt or a dress. I radioed my supervisor to report what had happened. His response was dismissive. "Probably just a prank," he said. "Kids like to mess with the towers sometimes. Don't worry about it." But I did worry about it. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop at the door. I was lying in bed when I heard them, slow, heavy steps pacing around the balcony. They circled the cabin, stopping every few seconds before continuing. My breath caught in my throat as I realized whatever it wasn't leaving. The pacing went on for what felt like hours. Finally, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Then the whispering began. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It came from all around the cabin, overlapping voices that spoke in a language I didn't understand. The sound seeped into my bones, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I stayed awake until sunrise, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me alive. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the voices stopped. The next morning, I found more of the twig bundles, 5 of them this time, arranged in a circle around the base of the tower. Each one was tied with the same tattered cloth. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But the nearest ranger station was a 4-hour hike, and my supply drop wasn't scheduled for another 3 days. I told myself I could wait it out. That night, everything escalated. It started with the pacing again, the slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head and squeezing my eyes shut. But then the knocking started, 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the door. I didn't move. The knocks came again, harder this time, shaking the door on its hinges. My heart pounded as I sat frozen in bed, gripping the flashlight. Then the door began to creak open. The lock was still in place, but the door opened anyway, the wood groaning as it swung inward. My flashlight flickered to life as I pointed it at the door, but there was nothing there, just the empty balcony beyond. But the whispering returned. It was louder now, almost deafening, the overlapping voices filling the cabin. They came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. My head spun as I stumbled toward the corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall. Then I saw it. A shadow moved across the room, tall and angular, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't walk, it shifted, gliding across the floor toward me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam barely illuminating its shape. It stopped just a few feet away, and for the first time, I saw its face, or what was left of it. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull the light into them. Its mouth hung open too wide, filled with jagged teeth that jutted at odd angles. It didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, oppressive and suffocating. I don't remember much after that. I think I passed out from fear. When I woke up, the sun was rising, and the cabin was empty. The door was closed, the lock still in place, but the twig bundles were gone. I packed my things and left that morning, hiking down the mountain without stopping. I didn't care about the job or my belongings, I just wanted to get out of those woods. When I reached the ranger station, I told my supervisor what had happened. He gave me a strange look and said, "You're not the first. That tower's been giving people trouble for years. Most don't last more than a few weeks." I quit on the spot. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard in that cabin. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just my imagination or a bad dream, but deep down, I know the truth. Some places are cursed, and some things should be left alone. I never thought I'd take a job as a fire lookout. Spending 3 months alone in a tower sounded like the perfect way to go insane. But when my life fell apart, my job, my relationship, everything, I needed to escape. The solitude of the Rocky Mountains seemed like the perfect solution. The tower was perched on the edge of a rugged cliff, miles away from anything resembling civilization. It had a 360-degree view of dense pine forests, jagged peaks, and valleys that disappeared into shadow as the sun set. My only connection to the outside world was a two-way radio. At first, the silence was a balm to my frayed nerves. Days passed in a blur of coffee, books, and scanning the horizon for smoke. Nights were even better, with the stars brighter than I'd ever seen. It felt like I'd finally found peace. But that peace didn't last. It started on the 3rd night. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a sound outside, a soft thud, like something landing on the balcony. My eyes snapped open, and my pulse quickened. I stayed still, listening. Another thud. I sat up, grabbing my flashlight from the nightstand. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight streaming through the windows. "Probably a bird," I muttered, trying to calm myself. I stepped onto the balcony, sweeping the flashlight over the wooden planks. Nothing. The air was still, and the forest below was silent, too silent. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I stayed outside for a few minutes, scanning the area, but saw nothing unusual. Eventually, I went back to bed. The next morning, I found footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the thin layer of dust on the balcony. Bare footprints, long and narrow, with toes that were almost claw-like. My stomach turned as I followed them. They started near the railing, stopped at the center of the balcony, and then disappeared. I radioed my supervisor, but he laughed it off. "You're in the middle of the woods," he said. "Probably just some animal." But I knew no animal left prints like that. That night, the thudding returned. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I stayed in bed, gripping the flashlight, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound moved around the cabin, as if something was pacing on the balcony. Then came the knocking, 3 slow, heavy knocks on the door. I didn't move. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. The knocking came again, louder this time, shaking the wood. And then, silence. The next morning, I found claw marks on the door, deep gouges raked across the wood, as if something with impossibly sharp nails had tried to force its way in. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and hiked back to the ranger station. But I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I hadn't slept well, the isolation was getting to me. That's what I told myself. But the following night shattered any illusions I had. It started the same way, the thudding, the pacing, the knocking. But this time, it didn't stop. The knocking grew frantic, the door rattling on its hinges as if something was trying to break it down. I grabbed the flashlight and a knife from the kitchen drawer, my hands shaking. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. Then, from outside, a voice whispered, "Let me in." It was soft, almost melodic, but wrong. It didn't sound human. "No," I stammered. "Go away." The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I'm lost." I didn't respond. My heart felt like it was about to explode. The voice changed, becoming deeper, guttural. "Let me in," it growled, the words distorted, like they were being spoken through clenched teeth. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the knife. Then the scratching started. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, long, deliberate scrapes, like nails being dragged across the wood. The sound surrounded me, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. And then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stayed in the corner, too terrified to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. When I finally opened the door, I found the balcony covered in claw marks. They were everywhere, on the floorboards, the railing, even the walls. And at the center of the balcony, written in what looked like ash, was a single word, "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I radioed my supervisor and told him I was leaving. He sounded annoyed but didn't argue. I packed my things, strapped on my backpack, and started down the trail. The forest felt different that day, the air was heavy, and the trees seemed darker, their twisted branches reaching for me as I passed. Every snap of a twig made me jump, my nerves fraying with each step. About halfway down the trail, I saw it again, the figure. It was standing in the distance, partially hidden behind a tree. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow, dark pits. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed at me. I ran. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, my chest heaving and my legs burning. When I told the rangers what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older man named Bill, pulled me aside. "You were at Wolf Ridge, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That tower is cursed. Always has been. They say something lives in those woods, something old. Most folks don't last more than a few weeks up there. I quit that day. I don't know what I saw in the forest, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of knocking at my window, and I can't help but wonder if it followed me home." I never believed in ghosts or spirits, not until I spent a week at the Oak Hollow lookout. If you're thinking about taking a job as a fire lookout, let me tell you this, there's a reason some towers stay vacant. Oak Hollow Lookout was infamous among rangers. Built in the 1940s, it sat atop a ridge in a remote section of Appalachia. The surrounding forest was old, the kind of old where the trees seemed to lean in, whispering secrets to each other. When I was assigned to Oak Hollow, I brushed off the stories my coworkers told me, the one about the missing ranger, the whispers people swore they heard over the radio late at night. I figured it was all just campfire talk to scare the new guy. The first day was uneventful. The tower itself was rickety but functional, its wooden beams groaning in the wind and the glass windows so scratched they blurred the view. But it was peaceful. I settled into the routine, scanning the forest for smoke, jotting weather observations, and sipping coffee as the sun set behind the mountains. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But something woke me around 3 a.m., a loud, rhythmic knocking. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from below the tower. It wasn't an animal, it was deliberate, human. Grabbing my flashlight, I leaned out over the railing. "Hello." I called into the darkness. No response, just the wind rustling through the trees. I scanned the ground below, my flashlight beam cutting through the black. Nothing. But the knocking stopped. The rest of the night was quiet, though I barely slept. The next day, I searched the area around the tower. The dirt trail leading up to the ridge was undisturbed, and there were no signs of footprints or animals. I convinced myself it was just the wind rattling the old wood. That night, it happened again. This time, the knocking came from the stairs, slow, deliberate knocks ascending one step at a time. I froze in my cot, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The knocking stopped. Then a whisper floated through the still night air, faint, barely audible. "Help me." The voice was soft, trembling, and close, too close. It sounded like it was coming from just outside the door. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight shaking as I aimed it at the door. "Who are you? What do you want?" No answer. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found something on the balcony, a child's shoe, small, weathered, and covered in dirt. It looked like it had been out there for years, but I knew it wasn't there before. I radioed my supervisor to report what had happened. He was dismissive, saying, "The forest can play tricks on you. Don't let it get to you." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But that night, the whispers returned. They started softly, like the rustling of leaves, but soon they grew louder, overlapping voices filling the air, each one pleading, crying, or muttering unintelligible words. "Help me. Why did you leave me? Don't look away." I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices seemed to seep into my skull, vibrating in my bones. Then the door creaked open. It shouldn't have, I'd locked it. My flashlight flickered as I turned toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. Something stood in the doorway. It was a shadow, tall and thin, its edges flickering like smoke. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its arms hung too long at its sides. It didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The air in the room grew cold, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. The shadow raised a hand, pointing at me. Its fingers were impossibly long, ending in sharp, blackened tips. "Why did you leave me?" it said, its voice a guttural rasp that made my skin crawl. I don't know what you mean," I stammered. It didn't respond. It just stood there, pointing, as the room filled with whispers. And then it was gone. The whispers stopped. The cold faded. I sat on the floor, shaking, until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows. I left that morning. I didn't pack, I didn't care about the job or the paycheck. I just grabbed my keys and ran down the trail, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't tell my supervisor why I left. I just said I wasn't feeling well and drove home. A few weeks later, I started digging into the history of Oak Hollow Lookout. I had to know what I'd seen, what had happened there. What I found chilled me to the bone. In the 1960s, a ranger named John Reeves worked at the tower. He had a young daughter, Clara, who sometimes stayed with him during the summer. One day, Clara wandered into the forest and disappeared. Despite an exhaustive search, she was never found. John was devastated. He blamed himself, convinced she had been calling for him and he hadn't heard. A few months later, he hanged himself in the tower. Locals claimed that on quiet nights, you can still hear Clara calling for her father, and if you're unlucky, you'll see him too, searching for her, his shadow lingering in the doorway. I don't know if I saw John, Clara, or something else entirely. All I know is that whatever haunts Oak Hollow isn't at rest, and it never will be. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers. When I first applied to be a fire lookout in the Cascade Mountains, I thought I knew what I was getting into: solitude, breathtaking views, and endless hours of peace. What I didn't expect was to come face to face with something that made me question my sanity. The lookout tower I was assigned to was isolated, perched on the edge of a rocky outcrop overlooking a dense forest. It was an older tower, built decades ago and rarely used now that newer ones were in place. They sent me there because it was quiet, too quiet, as I'd soon learn. The first few days were uneventful. I settled into a routine of scanning for smoke during the day and watching the stars at night. The radio crackled with the occasional check-in from my supervisor, but otherwise, I was completely alone. The silence was comforting at first, but on the fourth night, I realized how oppressive it could be. It started with a faint sound, almost imperceptible. I was sitting on the balcony, sipping tea, when I heard it, whispering. I froze, straining to hear. It was so soft, it could have been the wind, but it had a cadence, a rhythm that sounded unmistakably like speech. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing into the darkness. The whispering stopped. I told myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. That night, I locked the door and double-checked the windows before going to bed. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the tower. There was an old trail leading into the forest, overgrown and barely visible. My supervisor had warned me to stick close to the tower, but curiosity got the better of me. About a mile in, I stumbled upon something strange, a small clearing with a ring of stones at its center. The stones were blackened, as if they'd been burned, and the ground inside the circle was barren, devoid of grass or leaves. The air felt heavy there, like it was pressing down on my chest. I didn't stay long. That night, the whispering returned. It was louder this time, more distinct. It seemed to come from all around the tower, voices overlapping, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. I tried to ignore it, burying my head under the pillow, but it only grew louder. Then, over the whispers, I heard something else, a single voice, clear and desperate. "Help me." I shot upright, my heart pounding. The voice had come from outside, from the base of the tower. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped onto the balcony and aimed the beam into the darkness. "Is someone out there?" I shouted. The forest below was still, the trees casting long, jagged shadows in the moonlight. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was small, childlike, with pale skin that almost seemed to glow in the darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. "Help me," it said again, its voice thin and trembling. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I gripped the railing. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure stopped, tilting its head to the side. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed at me. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, and when I blinked, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I radioed my supervisor and told him what I'd seen. He was dismissive, chalking it up to isolation and an overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't imagining things. The day passed uneventfully, but as night fell, I felt a growing sense of dread. The forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Around midnight, the knocking started. It was faint at first, a soft tapping at the base of the tower. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was climbing the stairs. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the door. The knocking stopped. Then, from outside, a voice whispered, "Let me in." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's there?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. "Go away," I shouted, my voice trembling. The door rattled, the knob twisting as if someone, or something, was trying to open it. "Let me in," the voice repeated, louder this time. I backed into the corner, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then a shadow moved across the window, a tall, thin figure with elongated limbs and a face that was all wrong. Its features were distorted, its mouth too wide, its eyes black and empty. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as I stumbled back. The shadow lingered for a moment before disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed my things and prepared to leave. But when I stepped onto the balcony, I found something that made my blood run cold. The stones from the clearing, the blackened, burnt stones, were arranged in a circle around the base of the tower. I didn't look back as I hiked down the trail, my legs trembling with every step. When I reached the ranger station, I told my supervisor I was done. As I was leaving, one of the older rangers pulled me aside. "You were at Oak Ridge Tower, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "They built that tower on a burial ground, native burial ground. People warned them not to, but they didn't listen. Strange things have been happening there ever since." I left without another word. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard at Oak Ridge. I try not to think about it, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, and I wonder if whatever was out there followed me home. I took the job as a fire lookout in the Black Hills because I wanted solitude. I'd been through a rough breakup, and the thought of escaping to the mountains sounded perfect. 3 months alone in a tower, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife, what could go wrong? The lookout I was assigned to was called Wolf Ridge Tower. It was one of the oldest towers in the area, built back in the 1930s. Its creaky wooden steps and weathered structure made it seem like it had been there forever. The nearest ranger station was over 10 miles away, and my only contact with the outside world was a two-way radio. At first, everything was fine, peaceful, even. The days were filled with blue skies and the occasional hawk circling overhead. At night, the stars were so bright, it felt like I could reach out and touch them. But by the second week, things started to feel off. The forest around Wolf Ridge was dense, with thick pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It always seemed darker there, even during the day. And it was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier as the days passed. One evening, as the sun was setting, I noticed movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but the way it moved wasn't right. It was fast, almost too fast, darting between the trees like a shadow. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the forest. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and it had no face, just a smooth, blank surface where its features should have been. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring, or at least, I think it was staring. Then, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, it stepped back into the shadows and vanished. I tried to radio the ranger station to report what I'd seen, but the signal was full of static. I spent the rest of the night locked inside the tower, every creak of the wood making my nerves jump. The next morning, I went down to the forest to look for any sign of what I'd seen. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. That night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a faint tapping on the side of the tower. I ignored it, telling myself it was the wind. But then it grew louder, more insistent, knock, knock, knock. It sounded like it was coming from the door at the base of the tower. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it down the stairs, my hands trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from outside, I heard a low, guttural growl. I slammed the door to the cabin and locked it, barricading it with a chair. I didn't sleep that night, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hands. The following day, I found claw marks on the wooden steps leading up to the tower, long, deep scratches that hadn't been there before. I radioed my supervisor again, but the signal was still too weak to get through. I was completely alone. That night, things escalated. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, each step creaking under the weight of something heavy. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then a voice whispered, "Let me in." It was soft, almost childlike, but there was something wrong with it. The tone was distorted, unnatural, as if it were trying to mimic a human voice but couldn't quite get it right. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The voice didn't respond. Instead, the doorknob rattled, the sound sending chills down my spine. I grabbed the hatchet I kept by the bed, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The doorknob stopped rattling, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, "Let me in." I stayed awake until dawn, the hatchet clutched in my hands, but nothing else happened. The next day, I decided to leave. I didn't care about the job or the paycheck, I just wanted to get out of there. As I was packing, I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks had been arranged in a circle at the base of the tower. In the center of the circle was a single black feather. I don't know why, but the sight of it filled me with a deep, primal fear. I left everything behind, my gear, my supplies, even the radio, and started down the trail. The forest felt different as I walked through it, darker and more oppressive than ever before. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. About halfway down the trail, I saw it again, the figure. It was standing in the middle of the path, its blank face tilted slightly, as if it were curious. I froze, my heart pounding. Then it started to move toward me. I ran. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, my chest heaving and my legs burning. When I told the rangers what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older man named Bill, pulled me aside. "You were at Wolf Ridge, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That tower is cursed. Always has been. They say something lives in those woods, something old. Most folks don't last more than a few weeks up there. I quit that day. I don't know what I saw in the forest, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of knocking at my window, and I can't help but wonder if it followed me home." I wasn't supposed to be at Clear Ridge Lookout. Another ranger, Greg, was supposed to take the post, but he backed out at the last minute, claiming he wasn't feeling well. I volunteered, the overtime pay was too good to pass up. Clear Ridge was remote, even for a fire tower. It sat deep in the Rockies, accessible only by a winding dirt road that was barely a road at all. The tower itself was old, constructed in the 1940s and hadn't been used regularly in decades. The higher-ups figured it was a cost-effective way to spot fires in the region, but it felt forgotten, like a relic of the past. I arrived in the late afternoon, my truck kicking up a cloud of dust as I parked at the base of the tower. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. The tower loomed above me, its wooden structure weathered and creaking in the breeze. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint whistle of the wind. I climbed the narrow stairs, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, the cabin was sparse, just a cot, a desk, and the observation equipment. It was enough. I unpacked my bag and settled in for what I expected to be an uneventful week. That night, as the stars blinked into view, I sat on the balcony, taking in the vast, dark expanse of the forest below. The silence was almost oppressive, it felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. It was faint, a high-pitched whistle coming from somewhere deep in the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It rose and fell, almost like a tune. Grabbing my flashlight, I scanned the forest below. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. The whistling stopped. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination, and went inside. But as I lay in bed, the sound returned, faint and far away. This time, it was joined by another sound, a low, guttural hum. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I radioed my supervisor to report the strange noises. He laughed it off, saying, "It's just the wind. Happens all the time up there. Don't worry about it." I wasn't convinced, but I had no choice but to stay. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to take a walk down the trail leading from the tower. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead and blocking out what little light remained. About a mile in, I found something strange, a clearing. At its center was a circle of stones, blackened as if they'd been burned. The air in the clearing was heavy, thick with the scent of ash and something else, something metallic, like blood. The ground inside the circle was bare, not a single blade of grass or fallen leaf. It felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a faint sound behind me, the whistling. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the clearing. It was empty. The whistling grew louder, coming from the direction of the tower. I ran. By the time I reached the tower, the whistling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I climbed the stairs two at a time, locking the door behind me. That night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap at the base of the tower. But it grew louder, more insistent, echoing up the stairs. I grabbed the hatchet I kept by the bed and stood frozen, listening as the knocking moved up the steps. When it reached the top, it stopped. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. No response. Then, from outside the window, a face appeared. It was pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. Its features were stretched, distorted, like a painting that had melted. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the hatchet. The face pressed closer to the glass, its grin widening. Then it spoke, "You shouldn't have come here." Its voice was low, guttural, and layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. The window shattered as I swung the hatchet, the blade sinking into the frame where the face had been. But when I looked again, it was gone. The rest of the night was a blur. I huddled in the corner, clutching the hatchet, jumping at every creak and groan of the old tower. At dawn, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to wait around to see whatever the thing was again. As I packed my bag, I noticed something outside, a trail of footprints leading from the base of the tower into the forest. They were large, human-like, but the toes were elongated, tipped with sharp points. I didn't follow them. On the drive back to the station, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen, but none of it added up. When I arrived, my supervisor took one look at me and shook his head. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his tone grim. I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed, lighting a cigarette. "Clear Ridge has a history. Locals say it's cursed. People go missing out there, and when they're found, well, let's just say they're not the same." I quit that day. Even now, years later, I can still hear the whistling in my dreams. It's faint, distant, but it's there. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can see a pale face staring at me from the shadows.